So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Depend upon where are you. So, welcome to this seminar series of interdisciplinary program in climate studies. On behalf of climate studies, as a seminar coordinator, I welcome you all of you for this seminar. So, before going to the seminar, I just briefly tell about our IDP climate studies. The interdisciplinary program in climate studies, we often called as IDP program in climate studies, was initiated at IIT Bombay in January 2012. So we are offering PhD level programs, and we also undertake interdisciplinary research and education to develop a scientific understanding of our regional climate change, and it connects it to impacts environmental resources as well as socioeconomic. And also we will also work on the adaptation technologies. We are also offering postdoctoral programs in the interdisciplinary program in climate studies. So this, as a part of this, our center, we have initiated the seminar series since 2014. So till before COVID, it was in-person mode, and due to COVID, now we have taken a new form through virtual mode. So this year we have restarted our seminar series in virtual mode, and we have lined up a lot of talks. As the first talk in this series, we have Dr. Ivan from United States of America to give about the climate startups industries. And about the seminar series, today's seminar series, so we are having about 235 registrations from various parts of the world. 85% of the registrations are from India, and remaining is from USA, Netherlands, Germany, as well as in Nigeria and some parts of Japan as well. So I welcome you all once again to this seminar. Now I'll hand over the forum to Professor Subimal Ghosh, who is the convener of this IDP program, to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks for the introduction to IDP climate studies. In fact, this year has been a special year for climate scientists because we have seen the IPCC Year 6 report is out, and at the same time, this is the year where climate scientists got the Nobel Prize in Physics. So which is kind of a proud moment for all the climate scientists. Which is a great moment for all of us, and this actually increases the responsibility of the climate scientist. So now the climate scientist's responsibility is not only to produce the kind of a scary picture for the future. It's not only that, but we also need to show what are the solutions, what are the climate solutions, how to improve climate services for a better adaptation and mitigation. So of course we are saying act now, but we also have to mention that what to do and how to act. So those are the important questions which we need to address. And in this regard, I think it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Evan Kodra, who is a very good climate and data scientist, and at the same time one of my very good friend. We spent good time at Oak Ridge National Lab for quite some time, for 6 months or so. So I'll just quickly introduce Dr. Evan Kodra. He is a climate and data scientist who is passionate about advancing social and climate justice through his personal and professional work. He's a Level 11 Analytics partner and is the co-founder of and the CEO of a company, risQ. And this risQ is an NSF grant-funded data research and information services company, which is focused on catalyzing an equitable and just response to the interrelated crisis of climate, environmental, and socioeconomic inequality. Evan did his PhD from Northeastern University, Interdisciplinary Engineering. He did his PhD from the Sustainability and Data Sciences Lab, and he holds BS and MS in Statistics from University of Tennessee. And his research work focuses on multiple dimensions of climate change. And he has published quite a number of publications in scientific reports, PLOS ONE, GRL, ERL, and many more. And during his tenure at risQ, the startup which he has founded, the company has raised almost $2 million in grant funding. And it is also a leading provider of climate and environmental social governance data, research, and analytics to almost 20 distinct stakeholder institutions in US public finance and real estate markets. These are the sectors that have the apparatus, incentives, and the mandate to finance climate adaptation and mitigation in the US. So I will not waste much time on. Now I request Dr. Evan Kodra to kindly over to you, Evan.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Subhamal. Yeah, you make it sound like I'm smarter than I feel. That was a really kind introduction, and it's good to reconnect with you. So I will. This is probably going to be. I could hit a lot of different things in this talk. I will try to not be too wordy and go on forever, so that we have time for Q&A if people are interested in asking different questions. I will try to cover a bit of like my journey from kind of transitioning from working on climate science in a more academic context into how we got here, and how we're at where we're at. As Subhamal sort of summarized in terms of what we do now and what that means and what we're focused on. Let's jump into it. So this is a very high level kind of almost marketing summary of what risQ does as a company. This has evolved very much over time. We started the company in 2016, as he mentioned, originally funded by National Science Foundation, U.S. National Science Foundation Small Business Innovation Research Funding, which is a great program. I'm not sure of what the international equivalents are in other countries or if there are any, but that program is essentially, you can think of it as grant funding that is meant to accelerate ideas that are very technical in nature, often academic startups, and those types of ideas that are not actually ready for example, more conventional venture capital or investor-based funding. So it hits that sweet spot for scientists that have an idea and maybe it's not quite fully baked yet, but it's innovative. And they're not ready to raise $30 million or something crazy like that, but it can get them to that point, and that's exactly what we did. And I don't think it would have been possible to start this company and get it to where it is without that program. So it was the company was co-founded by myself, another guy named Colin Sullivan, who I met at Northeastern University when I was doing my PhD there, and Dr. Arup Ganguly, who was my PhD advisor and who was actually the way that me and myself and Subhamal got connected at Oak Ridge National Lab. So it all goes back to sort of the same roots. At this point, what we do as a company is, at a high level, we do physical climate risk modeling. We've more recently gotten into carbon transition risk data. And then in the middle, you see social impact and ESG data. ESG stands for environmental social governance, for those who have not heard of this. It is kind of a really quickly growing paradigm of or framework for investing, for investors thinking about trying to make a social impact or leverage their investment dollars to drive things like fixing social inequality, adapting to climate change, investing in renewables, all those kinds of things. It's still a relatively new paradigm, I guess I would say, and it's not super well defined yet. And one of the things that we're trying to do is make that, from our perspective, be an ESG and climate data provider to investors that is, highly quantitative, rigorous, and helps them measure what their investments are doing in a precise way, so that it can empower them to actually make a difference. For those of you who have heard of ESG, there's been a lot of talk about greenwashing in the last year, and certainly some of that goes on, but that industry is definitely progressing, from my perspective, in a way that's becoming more and more useful over time. And it's not unrelated to of course, climate change and the climate crisis, and how to move dollars in a way that, or how to move money into things that are a net positive for society versus into yet more and more fossil fuels. So that's a very, very high level. I'll get into more about the details, especially on the physical climate risk side of things. My background is on the sort of data sciences and climate and applied climate science through the data science lens, which I'll talk about next a little bit. So when I was this is part of the sort of journey piece. I did a lot of publications in academia on different topics related to climate. A lot of that work was focused on looking at global climate model outputs and translating those into insights. As a statistician type of background, my primary focus for my PhD was looking at how do you take global climate models and turn them into probability distributions. So in their sort of native form, climate scientists will basically universally say that you can't think of global climate model projections as probabilistic. So I spent a lot of time working on how do you take, say a handful of GCMs outputs and turn them into something that looks more like a formal probability distribution for decision making. Now, of course, in academia, we did a lot of, frankly, hand waving stuff about what decision making actually is. So we would talk about things like intensity, duration, frequency curves, and how do you think about that from a probability distribution standpoint? How do we update those? But one thing I learned in trying to, and I'll get to that, is it's, there's a huge gap between, or there was, and that gap is shrinking, a huge gap in between sort of the concerns that we'll have as a climate science modeling community and how people are actually using or not using all of this great science on the ground to make decisions, and how to sort of close that gap is the main thing I've been trying to figure out for the last 5 years or so. So when we started the company, our original idea was, okay, let's take these GCM outputs, let's turn them into probability distributions, and then let's use those to what we now call condition catastrophe models, which are used. Catastrophe models have been used since the early 1990s to price insurance products, um, reinsurance products, insurance products, and things like catastrophe bonds. All of which are tools that are used to manage risk. That is actually climate risk. So, for example, if for those of you who've heard of places like Swiss Re, Munich Re, etc. I'm guessing there's a decent bit of people who've heard of these places, at least, maybe even some people that have experience working at places like this. Those are essentially large insurers of insurers that help, or they basically take premiums to insure large events that are sort of like binary. You could think of it as like there's either a major disaster or there isn't. So it's very different than a classic insurance problem where it's very actuarial and predictable. So when you think of a classic insurance problem, you could think of something like car insurance, where at a very high level, let's say in the US, it's very predictable year over year how many car accidents you're going to see, how many dollar losses you're going to see. And so there isn't sort of this, nobody's ever going to crash their car all at the same time, or at least I hope not. Um, Whereas with something like climate, you can have, and we're seeing this, we're certainly seeing this year, where you have, in the U.S. at least, just strictly speaking, there you're seeing, historic wildfires at the same time as devastating hurricanes, and then at the same time in other parts of the world, thinking of the flooding that we saw in Germany, for example. And I won't list out every one, but the point being that the reinsurance industry is sort of constructed to absorb a lot of these losses that are harder to predict and potentially devastating when they do happen, multi-billion-dollar type losses. So all that is to say, what we started the company to try to help. There are a handful and a growing number of companies that do the modeling that support these types of insurance decisions. And so we started, Arup and myself and a couple others started chatting with people at companies like AIR Worldwide, if you've heard of them, to get a sense for whether they actually bake climate change into how they do their models. And we found out pretty quickly, and this was, we started having these conversations about 6-7 years ago, that they don't use climate models directly or they don't look at climate change explicitly in how they do catastrophe modeling for the insurance sector. So we decided that we would pitch to the NSF this proposal of basically taking GCM outputs and kind of like folding this idea of what I did for my PhD, which is modeling of extreme precipitation using GCMs and turning that into a probability distribution, and then trying to figure out how to take those outputs and say, looking at something like how do you, if I'm looking at a particular location, and let's say I'm looking at a particular watershed in the U.S., how do I estimate the probability distribution of how a 100-year rainfall event is expected to change, and then somehow plug that into an existing catastrophe model. We decided not to build our own catastrophe model at the time. We'll bake it into an existing one, and then help those catastrophe modelers basically help them help their clients, which are insurance companies, understand how their portfolio, their risks to their portfolios would change in the future. So the NSF really liked that idea. We were really fortunate to win that first grant back in 2016 and start the company on that premise. Fast forward about a year and a half or so of really working hard on that problem. That particular idea didn't work in terms of the insurance sector itself. And, in retrospect, that probably took me longer than it should have to understand why that didn't work. But hindsight is 20/20, as they say. So, why didn't it work is the question. This was something that came out just a few months ago in the Financial Times, which I can very much relate to. It quotes some people that I know well, at least in terms of I know of them well. So Karen Clark, for example, basically started the entire catastrophe modeling industry in 1992. She's quoted in there. This was a lot around how my journey was, where we used to go talk to these insurance companies or reinsurance companies and catastrophe modeling companies, and they were all very technically interested in what we were doing and thought it was useful. But at the end of the day, that whole entire industry was essentially paying lip service to climate change, to not beat around the bush. And I didn't understand this at the time, but the long story short is, what I learned is that essentially there's no structural incentive for any particular person in that industry to care about looking at climate change. So there's a few underlying reasons for that. One is that almost all reinsurance contracts are underwritten on an annual basis, right? So nobody is tied to thinking about risk over a 10-year time frame. And what happens in practice is that, say, after there's there's generally a good set of knowledge around where climate risk is, right? There's a lot of really smart scientists serving that industry, building sort of tools that look at, you can think of it as and I'll get into how this works a little bit, because we do a lot of this actually, but looking into, what's the probability of a certain amount of loss that I could see to my portfolio of insured assets. To do so, you have to do a lot of stochastic and physical modeling around, for example, just because a category 5 hurricane hasn't hit Miami in the last 10 years doesn't mean it couldn't. So how much money could I lose? And as such, how should I price my insurance contracts? Well, because they're annual, and because the insurance market is pretty commoditized by this point, or very commoditized, and because all of these insurance companies have just lots and lots of capital, they're just sitting on lots and lots of money. They can afford to have bad years, but they're primarily competing on price, and so they're not necessarily they're not necessarily competing based on the best understanding of risk. They're competing based on getting market share from an industry that really hasn't seen that much growth in the last, say, decade or so. In addition to this, they really do understand at a high enough level where the big risks are. So if you're thinking of the U.S., for example, where there's a ton of economic value in Florida, but also a ton of climate risk. Informally, when I was talking to people in that industry, there's just a lot of people that were trying to just in total avoid insuring places like, places in Florida or places that they knew were high risk because it just didn't make sense for them from a bottom line perspective. And so what happened was, what ended up happening, and I'll show this in the next slide, is that all of those losses got pushed out of the insurance industry. So meaning like the insurance ecosystem itself, which is this sort of feels like a contradiction, was actually creating a problem rather than solving one, whether that was anybody's intention or not. So let's go to the next one. And this is sort of the high level thesis of risk at this point. And we strictly do modeling in the US for now. So everything I will talk about is US related, but is very, most of it generalizes pretty well to a global view. And eventually I'm sure the company will go the direction of doing all this modeling at a global level, but that's just a huge amount to bite off for a startup. So we haven't done that yet. So our thesis is essentially, so if you look at the graph on the left, it shows this thing that Swiss Re published, and this isn't even that new anymore, but it basically shows a divergence between the amount of climate and other disaster related losses in terms of how much is insured versus how much is not insured, and a lot of that is driven by the fact that the catastrophe modeling and insurance industry has gotten better at modeling and understanding risk, but also better at avoiding it. And so at this point, globally and in the US, the majority and a growing majority of the losses from climate events are completely uninsured. Well, so in terms of what does that mean what does that mean? That means someone is holding the bag, so to speak, on that, right? So in the US specifically, we think of this as a spectrum of public stakeholders, our public sector stakeholders that are that are exposed to this risk, more so even now than the insurance market. So that ranges all the way from the federal level, where for those who are familiar at all, there's a national flood insurance program, for example, and that's another complex thing to get into. But for example, the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a public program that sort of has historically subsidized development in risky places, going all the way back to post-Great Depression as an economic stimulus, is deeply, deeply in debt and would have gone into default if not for a bailout after a really bad hurricane season in 2017. And so that ends up being, a taxpayer burden, rather than a burden of the insurance markets. And then all the way down to the individual people, of course. So the vast majority of people that own homes in the US don't own flood insurance. And 80% or 90% of actual flood risk or something in that range is for residential homes, completely uninsured. So that creates a burden for those individual people. And the sweet spot for us in terms of where we work primarily is at the municipal level, which I'll get into a little bit about how that market works because it's not straightforward. But essentially at a high level, in the US, and this from my understanding is quite different than most other countries, has a really complicated public debt system with about 55,000 or so distinct what you would call issuers of debt. So those are cities, counties, hospitals, retirement communities, school districts, charter schools, all kinds of different borrowers that by now very much depend on large financial institutions as their credit cards to service to service basic operations and to invest in new infrastructure. And so that really complicated system depends very much on the value of property. So property taxes are used as the source of repayment for that debt. So at a very simple level, and let me go to the next slide, where of course, as a startup, we put ourselves right in the middle of this picture, but it's a very complicated sort of system. But I'll boil it down to sort of the main pieces. You have bond issuers up at the top that are essentially those cities and hospitals and school districts and all those things I was talking about. Those are distinct, and this is really key to understand. These are distinct boundaries that are, so distinct places in the U.S. that are fixed in terms of their location and the patches of dirt that they're tied to, which is very different than, say, the corporate sector or the insurance sector, where you can, you're looking at properties where you can, you could potentially relocate easily. The city of Miami, to pick on the classic example, is tied to the boundary of the city of Miami. And so the sources of tax revenue are very much driven by the property value that sits within that boundary that is Miami. And so bond investors over here are you can think of those as investors, or really what you can think of those as in a more sort of accurate view are the credit cards or lenders to cities and other types of issuers, but for short, I'll call them cities. So they lend money to cities to just fund critical services such as, the fire department, road maintenance, police, all that kind of stuff. And then there are a whole bunch of different types of bonds that you can, that cities will use or will So for example, a city might issue a bond to upgrade a storm system or a sewer system, sorry, or or utility infrastructure. So what we do is we sell, after the last few years or so, this market sort of woke up to the idea after a bunch of really bad events. So after, say, the fire that burned down, in particular the fire that burned down the city of Paradise in California, where a bunch of people in this market lost money because the city essentially disappeared altogether. They started getting worried about risk, whereas this market and historically has always thought of itself as a very, very low risk market. Between that and COVID-19, where kind of everybody realized that, all bets were off in terms of our understanding about, how much risk there actually is in a system like this, they got real interested. So over the last 2 years, we've put together a good business that includes, entities from all key stakeholders here. So the investors, or asset managers, the way you can think of it. We work with 20 plus now. I think it's about 25 asset managers that all buy, or they're all the lenders to cities, right? They all buy this debt, which means they essentially they get interest payments over long time periods, and then they get their principal back at the end. That's all tax exempt. So that's the big appeal of this whole market, is that you don't pay tax. For the most part, you don't pay taxes on interest payments that you get from municipal bonds. Then you have the issuers over here that again are tied to geography. They depend on this market to fund operations and to grow. Then there are other types of stakeholders like the rating agencies. So think of Moody's and S&P and all those that are essentially, like, you can think of that as your credit score. It's the same kind of thing as for an individual, but they assign credit scores essentially to the cities. And then there are, of course, by now, a lot of data services companies and analytics companies that are starting to pop up around that, helping everybody, trying to help, especially the investor side of the market here, understand all kinds of different things, beyond climate, including just general economics and social health of cities and all those kinds of things. So we serve now at this point, or we work with at least one stakeholder in every pillar of this market. And if you want to think about some of the key things here that are worth noting, unlike insurance, and this was important, an important realization for us. Unlike insurance, the most municipal bonds mature over a time span of 10 to 30 years, right? Which makes that incredibly important from a climate, it makes climate incredibly important, right? So when you're buying a bond, you are essentially assuming that that bond will be, that the city will be able to pay that bond back for the next 10 to 30 years. Well, because climate is now, you can think about the quick and dirty version of how to think about this. Climate change is exacting losses upon properties that are largely uninsured. Eventually that has the effect of eroding property value, and we're starting to finally see that happen materially, which then puts the ability of that city to raise money on taxes and pay back their debt at risk. And so once that story became sort of clearer and clearer to the market, they got more and more interested in doing this. Now, on the other hand, um, the municipal bond market is definitely a natural vehicle. This is very just at the early stages of starting to happen. It's also a natural vehicle for borrowing money to finance climate adaptation. So our whole mission as a company is essentially to say, the cities won't. Everything is driven by dollars. And this is a bit of a cynical view, but it is what it is. Everything is driven by dollars. If bond issuers or cities aren't worried about their access to credit, then unless they're motivated purely by goodwill, which they won't be, because cities don't have a ton of extra money to just spend on infrastructure for the most part, with a few exceptions, they won't do anything. So our goal was to basically empower the investors to understand the climate risk of the cities, which then comes back around to now they're starting to ask the cities questions about, like, what are you doing about climate change? And so there's this kind of wheel of motion that's happening where once the creditors or the investors understand what's happening, then the cities themselves have to care because their creditors do. And so what we want to do as a company is then give tools, or help the issuers somehow think about, well, how do I adapt? Well, the bond market is a natural place to actually borrow money to invest in climate infrastructure, and that's exactly what we're doing with one of the earlier projects with Boston Water and Sewer specifically, who is looking to adapt to climate change and build flood defense infrastructure, but needs to do a cost-benefit analysis to prove that that's a valuable investment and potentially raise that money via the bond market. So that's a very high-level view of what we're trying to do. I will quickly go through sort of, just hit some high points of what we do from more of a scientific point of view. I'm guessing some people are interested in that. So for example, one of the things that we do catastrophe modeling, but we do that with explicit climate change. So the technical thesis that we started with still very much holds, but we basically reapply it for a different purpose. There are bunch of things that we do that I could get into, but I decided to just cherry pick a few. So for example, what we do in particular, because I just was trying to anticipate what people might be interested in, but I'm happy to field questions shortly. I'm going to quickly go through the rest of these. For example, we do this idea, what we call climate conditioning, where we look at GCMs in their native form. We don't do the explicit downscaling that some companies are starting to do, and that is sort of a hot topic in climate literature. But we do this sort of Monte Carlo type simulation on top of a statistical model that builds a Monte Carlo simulation on top of. So, for example, there are 7 climate models that are available for commercial use. We use those 7 models to basically bootstrap together a Monte Carlo distribution of a quick and dirty Monte Carlo distribution of like an emulator of thousands of climate models. And then we get a distribution for key statistics. So for example, this is just a random spot we're looking at in northern Idaho in the US, where we're looking at average July daily temperature and what that synthetic distribution looks like in gray. And then what the distribution of temperature trends in terms of degrees Celsius per year looks like. And this is because this is a lot, tied back to my original PhD research, which is saying, You don't want to just depend on one or a couple GCMs. You want a probability distribution, and that idea has still been valuable, in what we do now. Then we take that. The key then we take that and we look at we combine that with classic catastrophe models, which I'll explain a little bit shortly. So for example, what you're seeing here is RCP 8.5, where we plug in the same type of idea you were looking at before. We generate a probability distribution for extreme precipitation change coming from those GCMs, and then we basically build a regression model at a high level between that and stream flow for fluvial flood, so basically water overflowing rivers, and look at how that is projected to change 100-year events. So essentially what you're looking at is a bunch of different watersheds here, and if you look at 2060, you can see some regions up in the Northeast US. You're seeing what used to be a 100-year flood could now be, a 50 or a 30-year flood. It's pretty scary. There are some places, down south where it's basically very little change. If you can see, it's a little hard to see, but there's a 100 to 110-year type of bucket here, which is saying like, in some places it'll get a little less risky, but in the majority of the US is going to get more risky, right? It just flows from straightforward sort of expectations of climate and its how in global warming in terms of how it translates to atmospheric moisture capacity. And then this is more of a standard conventional catastrophe modeling framework. You have three different components. You have a hazard, you have damage or vulnerability, and you have exposures here. Those are sort of the three key ingredients of a catastrophe model. Exposures, which I could also do an entire presentation on because we do a lot of work with modeling. Well, what is the exposure, right? Meaning where is the property value? How do we infer how much it's worth? There is nobody's giving us a data set of that, right? There's no city is giving us that data set, so we have to estimate that on our own. But basically at a very high level, given a flood depth, given a property, characteristic, we know how, from damage functions to construction, basically a structural engineering science problem here. What is the expected damage that's done to that building, which then you can basically get something like, say you have, when you roll all this up over many properties, you could say for a given city in the US, on an annual average basis, what do we expect to see in terms of insurance equivalent losses? And then we normalize that by the total value. And then we would call that something like, for example, we might say, okay, in this particular county, we expect on an annual average basis 1% property losses. And then we look at that explicitly year over year as an expectation of that climate conditioning thing that I was talking about a minute ago. So when I look out at 2060, what does that annual expected loss look like versus 2040? And then we tie all that to the maturity length of the bond. So if there is a bond that matures in 10 years, then we look at all 10 years of that and we roll that out to a annualized average loss over the 10-year lifetime of that bond. And we give clients analytics that let them compare all different bonds and understand which ones are riskier than others. Because for them, it's basically, they need this in a simple way, right? You can think of them as, they're investors that are used to working in Excel files. So we do all this crazy stuff and then we package it up in a relatively simple data structure that says, here's the annual expected loss and other metrics like that. That you can use to analyze and compare different investments, manage your portfolio, and so on. So real quickly, we've done this, but then we package it up in a simpler way, as I was kind of alluding to. We push out, so we have flood models, hurricane models, wildfire models right now. Those are sort of the key metrics in the US at least. Very complicated, and we had to, because these are, this is brand new for this market as of 2 years ago, we had to package this up into a one score type of metric that people could understand. And then we use this to communicate sort of the importance of that metric for the outcomes that underpin the market. So for example, The risk score is essentially this 0 to 5 score that's like takes all this complexity and boils it up to, for a given bond or a given location, um, or even a given a given mortgage, let's say property mortgage. What's the risk score? 5 means the highest physical climate risk you'll see. 0 means essentially no risk. We do some basically econometric modeling, and this is kind of what my job has become, is this translation to sort of insight for people, because we've hired a whole bunch of people that understand all the catastrophe modeling and climate science better than me by now. But for example, when you look at the right, we look at residential property value, home price appreciation in the U.S. against the risk score and its component scores, flood, wildfire, and hurricane, and look at how that relates to home price appreciation after taking into account other things that we know are important. So, for example, regional trends, socioeconomics, and so on. And so this is kind of how we prove to the market that this is already happening, right? And then this is another way that we sort of talk about, like, this isn't just happening in property value. There are multiple examples by now, if you dig, that sort of show that this is starting to this is becoming a real problem. One of the things worth highlighting on the right is that it's primarily happening for small cities right now. Right, it's going to be harder for a Miami, even though they make the news more, Miami or New Orleans or one of these bigger cities, because there's so much economic base there. It's going to be hard for those places to go bankrupt. But the quieter stuff that's already happening, for example, Lake Charles, Louisiana, is a really sad and key example, where you're already seeing that city essentially facing bankruptcy. There are multiple examples where that's already happening, and so what we're trying to do again is just compel the investors to really understand that, hey, this is happening. This isn't new anymore. We've kind of crossed that hurdle, and now we're getting to the point where the cities themselves are starting to worry about it and ask us questions, which is good. It's the second step in sort of the puzzle. On the climate and environmental justice side of things, um, we've one of the sort of key things that's important to me in particular, and all of us, is that we understand that essentially investors in a vacuum are motivated by protection of wealth. And so what will happen if you think about those last examples that I was talking about with the smaller towns, those are typically almost always smaller, more, poorer towns that are going bankrupt, right? In a vacuum, without thinking about the social component of this, climate risk data for investors would essentially encourage an acceleration in divesting from poorer communities. This is true in the US, this is true globally. And so one of the things we've been very bullish about is reminding people of this and essentially scoring investments in other social ways, which I won't get into too much because I want to leave time for questions. But suffice it to say, a lot of the work that we do is around, from an ESG perspective, where you're supposed to be thinking about this from a socially responsible point of view. You can't just divest from places that are high climate risk. We also have to have strategies to help communities that do need the help, that have been disenfranchised. And in the US, there's been a lot of that, of course, rooting back to just the sort of history in the country, and why why poor people are sitting in high risk places in the first place has, everything to do with, explicit policy choices and lack of fairness in lending and structural racism, all that kind of stuff. So just a couple quick examples here where we show that in the US, people of color are less insured for flood systemically and disproportionately exposed to hazards like wildfire and all of that kind of stuff. And so from our sort of point of view, what we're always trying to compel investors to take in, to bear in mind is that, if you're going to call yourself an ESG fund and be socially responsible, a successful response to these types of crises has to address these inequalities in the process, or else it's just straightforward sort of protection of wealth. There's plenty else I could talk about, but I will stop there because we're at 10:17, and I definitely want to leave time for questions or clarifications because I know that this is a lot of density and probably quite different if you're coming at this from more of a physical sciences type of view, for example. So yeah, how do we want to do this, Shiva? Is it questions? Does anybody have questions?
Thanks, Evan.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
already
Shiva, you
have
can
many.
start the question answer session.
Yes, I'll start. So I'll be reading out the questions for you, Dr. Evan, and our student will also be copy pasting it in the chat box for everyone to see. So yeah, I'll just start. So the
Okay.
first question we have is, could you suggest precipitation prediction modeling techniques with the help of data science? What are the platforms used by your company for climate risk modeling, like ArcGIS Pro or AirDAS or AutoCAD, etc.?
Gotcha. So we do a lot of GIS work. The short answer is we don't do any of our work in anything like ArcGIS though. It's just not computationally, like the amount of computational work that we have to do is not like really amenable to that type of platform. Primarily everybody, so if the question is more about like the sort of tools, like the technical tools and choices like that, we tend to rely on R and Python primarily. But we also have a lot of in-house geospatial expertise that, so QGIS, for example, is an open source version of ArcGIS essentially, and is great for visualization. Wouldn't use it for analysis technically or typically. A lot of what we do have and have built is a geospatial platform that runs more in a SQL type environment. So we constructed this. We have a couple of people in house that figured out how to construct this, basically this grid that covers the U.S. and can be extended to the globe. Which can be then compiled down to a SQL table essentially, so that whenever you're running stuff in production, you're essentially running SQL queries. But a lot of the modeling that we do is built offline in platforms like R and Python, and then we essentially kind of hardwire it and then push it to this grid and then run all of our actual bond level calculations and stuff like that. In like a SQL type environment where it's just joins instead of running models on the cloud. I don't know if that answers your question.
Right. So next question is, do you also work on seismic disasters like earthquakes and volcanoes?
Yeah, so we definitely have clients that ask us if we'll do that. We've been very climate focused so far, so we haven't gone into the hazards that are sort of not in that that nobody expects are impacted by climate change. My guess is, so what we've really where we've really excelled is less on the, to be honest, is less on the physical risk modeling. I mean, we don't get me wrong, we do a lot of good work there too, but it's really on this thesis of what we're solving with it. So in the future, what's most likely going to happen for us is we'll either partner with an existing company or academic partner or whatever, which we do a lot of, to actually integrate, to bring in seismic risk and then push it into this platform, rather than sort of building it all ourselves. I mean, at this point, the actual hazard modeling market, if you will, is pretty sophisticated and has gotten is competitive. So we try not to reinvent the wheel if we don't have to. We work with the U.S. Forestry Service on wildfire. We work with a UK partner on flood modeling. We don't rebuild everything unless we don't reinvent the wheel unless we have to. But that's a good question.
There's a question from Shivram Mukherjee. He's asking, could you suggest how the ESG platform is going to enlighten in the climate risk modeling?
Yeah, sure. So ESG, there's a few different ways to answer that one. It's a good question. ESG is sort of a broad movement, I guess I would say, towards, like I was saying, this idea of doing, environmentally and socially responsible investing. That is really driven by a couple of different things. It's driven by, it's really driven by two things, basically. It's driven by partially by a younger generation of people that, for example, in your in a 401k or your retirement fund or whatever, people like my age and younger, like looking to, knowing that we're facing like the climate crisis and knowing how all of the problems in the world are getting worse. They want to be able to put their money in a retirement account and know it's not going towards oil and gas, for example. And so that there's that, and then there are at least in our market, there are a lot of, so 70%, let's say, so the US municipal bond market is like, the outstanding value there is like $4 trillion or something like that, US dollars. But 70% of that is controlled by a small handful of small net worth individuals. So they have a huge amount of leverage over essentially like how the investors that manage their money are spending it. And we've increasingly seen, since in the last few years, they're often called separately managed accounts. They go to a large financial institution and they give them $1 billion, and then they'll have specific things they want their money invested in. And increasingly they care about things like climate, because they're realizing that that's a huge problem. They're in the US at least, they're becoming more and more interested in structural inequality and racism, and how do I invest my dollars to help fix that. So it's coming both from that sort of younger generation, and it's coming from also these really high net worth people that have tons of leverage over how money gets deployed. And so a lot of that is going into what's shaping how then the investors are trying to allocate their money. And then there are the ESG and climate analytics providers that are kind of like us, that are trying to help those investors guide that money and say, okay, well, here's how you do it. So that means, we're focused on this municipal market. There's other markets that are really important for this that I know less about. So for example, corporates, how do you get corporates to do things more responsibly? Sovereign wealth and debt is a huge one, right? So when you think of the borrowing of money between countries, the buying and selling of debt between countries, how do you do that in an ESG friendly way, right? Because generally speaking, the global north has been the sort of global north, and if you call it European sort of colonization stuff, has been the reason that we have this problem, and industrialization is the reason that we have these huge problems in the first place. So from an ESG perspective, there are people talking about the need for the need for social responsibility and how ESG is deployed for sovereign lending. Right, because if climate risk becomes a penalty for countries in the global south that have been basically marginalized from the beginning and exploited, and their resources have been extracted from the beginning, it's just going to accelerate issues with other countries that weren't responsible for this in the first place. So there's a ton of work to be done in terms of how to. This is an important question. Sorry to be long-winded about it, but there's a ton of work to be done to make sure that ESG is actually, being deployed in a way that solves those problems. And a big part of it is analytics, and a big part of it is essentially the momentum that individual people can put behind it, in terms of demanding that their retirement funds are doing something good, and being serious about that. So there's a lot of power in sort of individuals and their own money.
Sir, the next question is, what are the major research or translational barriers you expect if this line of business were to be expanded in a developing country like India?
Yeah. So strictly speaking, on the sort of analytics or research part of it, the hardest part, so when I was talking about the catastrophe modeling stuff, there's, hazard, there's vulnerability, and there's exposure. The vulnerability and exposure parts are really hard. Part of the reason we chose to focus on there was a couple of reasons we chose to focus on just on the US to start with. One is that, I know the census data really well. There's a ton of really good data products out there on where property value is and how do you infer all these different types of things. Every country is different, right? So doing this at a global level, you don't always have that kind of data is just certainly not the same everywhere, and it's not as available everywhere. And so you're doing there's a lot more sort of work that's going to have to come into the estimation of, where where property value is, where GDP is being generated, what it looks like, what's going on where, because there's no authoritative source for that, and it's much, much harder. So I think that, the biggest challenge for us is certainly that component of it, and less so the hazard part. Actually, I think that, globally speaking, people, GCMs cover the globe. They do a pretty good job mostly, everywhere. Obviously, some places are harder than others because you have less observational data, but that I don't see as the hardest problem. I think it's mostly on this economic and social side of things from a data point of view.
Okay. So next question is, we know climate change will increase temperature and floods. Models say the same with uncertain magnitude. Why should a company rely climate modeler? Oh,
Sorry, can you ask that again?
they mean, why should a company rely on climate models, I guess?
Versus, so the question is, why should companies, well, I mean, they have, I mean, it's there's multiple ways to answer that. One is, like, there's, because there's uncertainty is this is something Arup and I always used to talk about, but just because there's uncertainty doesn't mean you don't do anything, right? So if there's plenty of uncertainty in GCMs and what they say about the future, but there's enough understanding at this point in terms of, what fundamentals are changing to the point where we know that, the climate is not stationary anymore, and really has never been. But we understand well enough, and GCMs at an aggregate level have been shown to be, fairly reliable in sort of predicting where we're at. Now, obviously, at a regional scale and an increasingly local scale, there's tons of uncertainty and all that. But in our experience, actually, people want to know. It's more of a, like, what's the worst case, what's the best case that could happen? Because you actually, uncertainty is not a reason not to do something. It's actually it's the other way around, right? If you can get a good confidence bound on what could happen, you can make more informed decisions. So, and this is common to infrastructure engineering practice, right? Now, you could say that there's those types of things should be updated, but if you think of things like, how do we design infrastructure, a lot of that is based on what's a 1 in 100 year or 1 in 500 year rainfall or, flood event, and so how do I have to protect this infrastructure? That by definition is dealing with uncertainty, whether you're talking about looking at GCMs or not. So when you think of GCMs as they're only one of the components of uncertainty, right? The much bigger uncertainty is like social and international and political response to all this stuff, right? So they get picked on quite a bit, because it's easy to do so, and because there's a long-standing history of political discreditation, or whatever you want to call it. People, fighting back against what the climate science community has said. But honestly, there's just way more uncertainty coming from other things, and that's not a reason not to examine the problem and think about it.
So next question is, what is the starting point to generate the damage function? What all data is needed?
Yeah, so again, so we have one of the leaders within our company is a civil and structural engineer by training, and he had worked at AIR worldwide for like 25 years. You know, we don't reinvent the wheel, we don't have to, like I was saying. So actually in the US, FEMA puts out a ton of data on damage functions that we essentially take and then tweak a little bit for our own purposes. What they do under the hood to get damage functions is essentially based on you can think of it as like, roughly speaking, like regression modeling on historical events and losses. So, and damage. So they have, FEMA in the process of developing these things. They of course have all kinds of data on historical floods, for example, historical fires, and then what actually happened to buildings as a function of that, and they have decades worth of that, and then they do develop like regression types of models based on all of that data that gives an estimate for if I have a single family house that's constructed of wood and it has no basement, then I have an estimate using 50 years worth of data or however much for what happens if there's 2 feet of water. And there's, again, this is another component that has plenty of uncertainty in it. But that's essentially what we do is we take that and then we kind of customize it a little bit for our purpose, but we didn't invent that part.
Right. So next question is, how do you evaluate the success of your risk score?
Yeah, so we built that score. So the risk score, we basically, we took all these underlying catastrophe models and then we calibrated it to insurance losses was the main thing that we did. So we took 30 plus years of losses from floods, hurricanes, and fires, and then calibrated it to that. So the risk score right now is and then, we sort of made it a blend of those three. So it's like, it's supposed to be representative of the kind of aggregate relative importance of those three different perils to losses. And when you boil that down, it's like 30% flood, 20% wildfire, and then 50% hurricane. There were a couple slides I showed on the relationship between that score and then other outcomes that are not directly insurance losses. So the insurance losses is an easy one because, um, you have data on that. It's a direct function of the events. It's a tricky problem in that, like, well, because there's so much that's not insured, it's hard to say for sure what happens when there's no insurance because there's no data on it. So there's that challenge. But on the whole, there's enough data to sort of examine that problem in a relatively clean way. And then the other outcomes that flow off of that, we did not. You can think of that as like a validation of our other thesis, which is that, because there's a lack of insurance or there's, general insurance gap, then that score should logically correlate to outcomes related to property value losses and mortgage delinquency and default and things like that. And we definitely see that as well. So that's more like a validation test in some sense that the model of the risk score doesn't see, but it's trained on insurance losses.
Yeah, so next question is, for generating a flood map, have you used bias correction? Because models have a lot of error, no?
Yeah, so actually, in the flood map itself, so we have flood maps that we get from our UK partner, and so there's all kinds of stuff they do upstream. To build a flood model in-house takes years and takes a few people, so we didn't build that in-house, again, in that spirit of not reinventing a wheel. That's, many people there are many flood models out there now. They're hard to make, but they're available. So we ended up partnering with the company. We use their flood maps, and then we do the climate conditioning component that I was talking about, where you look at the future change in the climate statistics that drive that flood risk. we actually do a lot of bias correction in that. I kind of glazed over that in the interest of time, but one of the parts of the GCM modeling that we do is that we look at historical data, we look at GCM historical runs, and then we do like a bias. The way that the climate conditioning component works is we do like a bias correction, a spatial bias correction between that GCM historical run and the actual historical data. And then once we've done that bias correction, we have like there's like a residual component, and then we do a Monte Carlo sampling on top of that residual component to get like a bias corrected, 10,000 bias corrected emulators of, climate models for that particular metric. So in that sense, there's bias correction going on actually at the GCM level. But the flood modeling happens outside of our purview.
So this is the last question now.
Cool.
So yeah, you spoke about how everything is driven by dollars. How do you work around
Sure.
that in? So can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, I can hear you.
So you spoke about how everything is driven by dollars. How do you work around that in climate action? Because climate action is expensive. How has your experience been in convincing clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like the question.
The question.
Yeah, one of the main questions that I think about all the time. So it is really expensive. One of the things I was talking about at one point was this project that we have with the specific pilot project that we have with Boston Water and Sewer Commission, which is basically they run the sewers in Boston, as the name would imply. Boston is a really progressive city in the U.S., and so they're interested in, for smart reasons, they're interested in adapting to climate change. So what that project is actually doing is looking at, so there's another company that's doing the engineering component of that. So they're basically proposing 10 different potential flood defense projects. Each one of them is going to be really expensive, potentially, with different levels of cost. But what we're, from the perspective of justifying that cost, which has been one of the hugest barriers that me and Arup used to scratch our heads about back when we were first thinking about this. We used to go to asset owners directly, more so, and talk to them about it. But in this case, so what we're trying to do is say, okay, for each of these 10, let's say 10 different flood defense proposals, we'll do a what if. We'll kind of do a model to look at what are the property losses over the next 30 years, like let's say 30 years, that you'd expect to see in the jurisdiction of the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, right? And then if you did flood, if you invested in project X, and then we essentially, in our model, we would mask out you think of this as like in a geospatial kind of view, like mask out the flood losses that you're protecting, redo those calculations, and then do some kind of basic net present value type calculations, discount rates and all that stuff, to essentially say, okay, the capital cost of this investment is X. But the benefit is the reduction in those losses, which is Y, and you can compare those two apples to apples essentially, and then you get a clearer view of, okay, well, does this actually make sense? And then theoretically, and we haven't gotten this far yet, this is like the next big thing I'm hoping. Theoretically, you take that, you then say, okay, now we have the, we're going to invest in this one. It's going to have this kind of payback in terms of reduction of losses. And because the investors in this market are all looking at the same kind of data, they're going to already understand it for the most part. And then that issuer can then take that to market and say, like, we want to do a debt-based financing to actually invest in that project so that we're avoiding these losses, and it's in your interest, it's in our interest, we're saving money, you're reducing risk. And that's sort of the way that we're thinking about it. But it's not an easy problem. Coming back to the climate justice part, right? That's only for like, Boston is a city that's, it's got a AAA rating, it's got tons of money. It's a place that is going to be able to do that sort of thing. When you think of Lake Charles, Louisiana, right now they're living in conditions that are, that basically, FEMA has once again not really done what it's supposed to do. People are still stranded without electricity, water, it's air conditioning, all that kind of stuff. That's the kind of city that's probably never going to be able to do this kind of thing. And so that's why we continue to come back to those examples for the market to understand what the reality is of your Miamis and your Bostons and your Seattles and all those places with tons of resources. They'll be able to pursue that model, but there's going to have to be some serious thinking about how do we help communities and people that don't have access to that type of credit.
Thanks, Dr. Evan. Dr. Evan, we have a very special question from one of our students, okay? So the student is asking if you would recruit IIT Bombay climate students after their PhD.
Yeah, I mean, yes, is the short answer. We have not hired anybody for the last year. We've been trying to, get to the point where we're, cash flow stable and all that kind of stuff, but we're certainly a growing company and would love to expand, especially when we eventually cross the bridge of expanding to an international sort of purview from both a modeling perspective, but also client services and understanding. I mean, the U.S. market is so different, right? So we'll absolutely, and Arupi and I used to talk about actually specifically trying to spawn up like a risQ India sort of thing. So I think that the answer is absolutely yes, but we're probably a year or two out from that right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evan. Now I'll request Professor Rajram Shankaran, who is our seminar coordinator, to please come on board and close the session.
So thank you, Dr. Evan Kodra, for a very nice, interesting talk on how you have transitioned from academia to industry on climate risk modeling and other things. I hope all of you have enjoyed this talk, and it's very innovative. And also, I have enjoyed the discussions also. It's a variety of questions asked by the different students and different participants. I thank one and all for participating in this seminar. And before closing the seminar, I just want to make two announcements. One is just please switch on your camera for we can have a group online photographs, because nowadays this is the only possible way.
Very true.
Yeah, in the meantime, another thing, so the next seminar talk is lined on 27th October by Professor Ashok Karumari from University of Hyderabad. So he is going to talk about climate science. Can we do decadal climate predictions in tropics? Is it feasible? So be ready, and I welcome you all to participate in that seminar also on 27th of October, which is on Wednesday. That will be from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. So please switch on the camera. So Shiba, if everything is ready, then you can take a photo, online photo.
Yeah. Please switch on your videos and please give a smile.
Say cheese. Yeah, say cheese.
Yeah, please smile.
I cannot give you cheese now, but please. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Evan Kodra, and thank you, Professor Subimal Ghosh, for allowing us to organize this seminar. And thank you, everyone, Shiba, Archismita, and other student volunteers who are doing the back-end work. See you all. Have a good night, a good morning, or good afternoon, depend upon the region where you are. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Evan. It was fabulous.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for inviting me. Have a good one, everybody.
Have a great day.